Okay, good evening, everybody. Tonight's lesson on Matis and Maseh. This is this week's Parsha. Our land, our home, what Israel means to us. Now, why are we talking about this in this week's Parsha? Because in this week's Parsha, we have the borders of Eretz Yisrael. Thank you. The borders of the land of Israel are delineated very clearly in the Torah. In text number 1a, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's just giving us physical markers and cities and specific points on the map, which we are not familiar with today because they don't go by the same names. Maybe some of them do, but generally speaking they don't. So let's just take a look at text number 1a briefly. God spoke to Moshe saying, "Command the children of Israel and say to them, when you arrive in the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall to you as an inheritance, the land of Canaan according to its borders. Your southernmost corner shall be from the desert of Tzin along Edom, and the southern border shall be from the edge of the Sea of Salt, the Dead Sea, to the east." So that's one marker that we're familiar with. The border then turns south of Malach Akrabim, passing towards Tzin, and its end shall be to the south of Kadesh Barnea. And it's a question of where Kadesh Barnea is exactly. Then it shall extend to Chazar Adar, and continue towards Atzmoin. The border then turns from Atzmoin to the stream of Egypt, and its ends shall be to the sea. So you see over here, the Torah is giving us the borders of Eretz Yisrael, very clear borders where our land is meant to be. The Torah is telling us very clearly, God is telling us this is where your land is, this is Eretz Yisrael. Why is it important to know exactly where the border is?
When you're fighting wars today?
So when you're fighting wars, that's an important thing. But in those days, obviously, they were going to fight the initial war, but the plan wasn't that they would end up having to continue to fight. The hope was that they would be able to dwell in peace. So why did they need to know their borders? Because there are specific mitzvahs that are meant to be performed in Eretz Yisrael. Don't forget, it was an agrarian society at the time. Even today, it's still to a large part, it still is. It's an agrarian society. Agriculture is a major part of the economy. And so there are specific mitzvahs that have to be performed with those specific portions of land. So it was important and critical to know, so where does this land extend from and to?
It's also holy land.
Oh, it's also holy land. But first and foremost, because it's you're correct, absolutely. What makes it the land where you have to perform these mitzvahs? The fact that it's a holy land. It's all really part and parcel. Okay. Now, we all love Eretz Yisrael. Every Jew, in fact, it's brought down that every Jew is entitled to a portion of land in Eretz Yisrael, which is 4x4. 4x4 meaning not 4x4 feet, but 4x4 ames. Arba ames. Every Jew, there's a portion of Eretz Yisrael that belongs to him or her. Arba ames. And in general, the Jewish people are referred to by Scripture as Eretz Chayfetz. Eretz Chayfetz. I just want to pass this down, just in case anybody wants to partake. And here you go. Here's some plates. Eretz Chayfetz. Sorry, guys who are watching online. The pizza's only for the people who are here. Sorry, I can't really help that. The Jewish people are referred to as Eretz Chayfetz, meaning a land which is desired, and that desire is very much in sync with the desire that Hashem has for Eretz Yisrael, as we'll talk about a little later. And so since we were exiled, we're always asking God to return us back to Zion, return us back to Eretz Yisrael. We've had a very long and difficult and bitter exile, and we've been yearning for over 2,000 years to return back to Eretz Yisrael. In text number 2, this is a quote from our liturgy in the Shemoneh Esrei in the Amidah prayer, page 36. "Raise a banner to gather our exiles and bring us together from the four corners of the earth into our land. Blessed are you, Lord, who gathers the dispersed of his people, Israel." And then that's the end of one blessing. And the next blessing further on is, may our eyes behold your return to Zion in mercy. Blessed are you, Lord, who restores his divine presence to Zion. At the Haggadah, during the Haggadah, when we recite the Haggadah of Pesach, so we always speak of this idea of redemption. God will redeem us ultimately from this exile. And then we conclude the Haggadah and we say, the Shana Haba Yerushalayim, in the coming year will actually be in Yerushalayim. So the yearning to return back to Eretz Yisrael is very much front and center in Jewish faith and Jewish practice. Now, what is our foundation to Eretz Yisrael? What is our foundation to laying claim to the land of Israel? So, of course, we just read in the pasuk. We just read the Torah gives us the borders. So we know from the Torah that this is the case. Today, in today's day and age, we hear many making different arguments, posing different arguments for our right to the land of Israel. First of all, there's the historic right. Historic right is that we've had many generations. I mean, you can make the case that even since the destruction of the temple, Jews have always lived in the land of Israel. So we never left. It was always our land. It was always remained this way. This is the way it is. This is the historical argument. Every time there's another, they dig up another archaeological find, which is fascinating. By the way, just recently they found this incredible walkway up to the Temple Mount, which they inaugurated with the ambassador. It was a fantastic find as far as archaeological discovery is concerned. And they're constantly finding this stuff. They're finding coins. They're finding artifacts. I mean, it's an amazing thing what they're able to demonstrate through archaeological digs. So every time there's such a discovery, so they say, it's always right there in the headlines. This demonstrates, this proves that we were here, our forefathers were here, and this gives us the right to the land. Now, mind you, UNESCO, which is an organization run by the UN, United Nations, who are, to put it lightly, they're not friendly to the Jewish people. So UNESCO makes the claim that the Temple Mount has absolutely no relationship with the Jewish people. No relationship with the Jewish people. So as many archaeological finds we're going to have, as many discoveries we're going to find, UNESCO is going to continue insisting that we do not have a relationship with the Temple Mount. It simply is a historical fact now that they voted on it, especially. So,
and
making the
best
case...
countries to vote.
Huh?
And they always get the best countries.
The best countries, sure. So making the historical case can be argued. It can be argued. How could it be argued? That the Jews spent equal amount of time. You're claiming they spent time in Israel? I'm going to claim, they say, that they spent equal amount of time in Europe, in Poland, in Germany. I don't know if anybody remembers. I think it was 2013, if I'm not mistaken, where you had a Rabbi, David Nesanoff, who was, at the time, I think he was a rabbi in some maybe conservative or reform temple, but he apparently was involved with filmmaking or reporting, or was a journalist. I don't remember exactly the details. But he met up with Helen Thomas. Helen Thomas was like the queen of journalists who sat in the White House corps of reporters. She used to sit in the front row. She used to pepper the spokesperson of the government with all kinds of questions, and she was rabidly anti-Israel. But she was a very well-respected journalist. And if you just type her name on you Google her name, you'll find all kinds of clips of her challenging the spokesperson for the government for the United States. She claimed, here you have a society, here you have a country that just massacres innocent civilians, they're massacring them, and so why are we supporting them? Why are we giving them military aid, etc., etc.? So this guy Nesanoff goes over to her and asks her, what do you think of Israel? So I'm going to tell you what she said. I'm just going to leave out the expletive. She said they should get the H-E-double-L out of there.
Well, that's like the four today, those Democrats.
Where should they go? Germany, Poland. Could you imagine 60 years after the Holocaust, we have a prominent United States journalist who says what? The Jews should return back to the gas chambers where they were burned to death.
Yeah, we have congresswomen now who say that.
So congresswomen, this is another thing. Yeah. But here you have a journalist who supposedly is supposed to be objective, etc. So this went viral. He actually videotaped this. This went viral, and she was forced to resign. She was forced to resign. It was a big deal, and then he went around the whole country speaking about it. Helen Thomas, Rabbi David Nesanoff. You can Google it. What's my point? My point is going back to the idea here that we just mentioned, that if we just stick to the historical claim, which is that we lived there, well, we lived elsewhere also. So go back there. Go back. Go back to Germany. Go back to Poland. Go back to where you came from. Go back to the United States. Go anywhere else besides for there. Now, the little secret is that she is Lebanese originally, apparently.
Well, that means Somalia.
So you have many such now unfortunately it's become something that already is espoused by government officials. At that time it was just a journalist. Now it's gotten, it's taken the next step. So what's my point? My point is only that if we just stick to the historical account and the historical claim, then we are bound to be challenged by an equally compelling argument, which is you spent a lot of time here, good, so you spent a lot of time elsewhere too. Another argument that's presented is the political solution. The political argument, which is that there was the San Remo Accords and the Balfour Declaration, and then you had the Peel Commission in 1937, and then you had the Partition Plan, the United Nations. So the United Nations voted, even Stalin's Russia voted to support the establishment of the State of Israel. So there you have it. The nations of the world agree that there should be a state for the Jews. It was just today. I was watching a video today of the chief of the of UNRWA, the UN.
Palestinian refugees.
Right, exactly, for the refugees. Yeah, and so he doesn't like this idea that the state of Israel should be a Jewish state. You can call it whatever you want. You can define yourself whatever you want, he says, but the idea that it's a Jewish state, this is a problem because everybody else becomes second-class citizens. Now, never mind that there are tens of Arab states that surround Israel, where the Jews weren't just second-class citizens; they were booted out. That's it. Once the state of Israel was established, then close to 1 million Jews had to leave their homes. Whatever the number was, they had to leave their homes, had to flee, and relocate to the state of Israel because they couldn't live there. Forget anybody else who doesn't bow to Islam or accept upon themselves to live by the standards of Islam. So that there's nothing to speak of. But in Israel, this is the problem. Just recently, the UN voted that the only state that would deserve condemnation was the state of Israel for not providing equal rights for women.
Right. It's so ludicrous.
It's just laughable. It's just laughable that in Saudi Arabia women are not allowed to drive, but in Israel, where women have equal rights, equal voting rights, they have very high paying job, whatever it might be, they're equal members of society. It's specifically the state of Israel that is singled out for condemnation for failing with regard to women's rights. It's a fascinating thing. What's my point? My point is that if we just rely on the historic argument, if we just rely on the political argument, then we run into problems. Because what's the response? The response is, okay, so in 1947 we allowed you to make a state, but at this point already, you're demonstrating that we can't trust you already. We can't trust you with making a state. You see, you abuse women's rights. You see? So we have to revoke that. So does the United Nations revocation of our permission to have a state, does that mean that we are not permitted to have a state no longer? Is that what it means?
We should quit the UN.
Is that what it means? Once the UN now says we no longer have the right to a state, therefore we no longer have a right to Eretz Yisrael? Is that what it's supposed to mean? In text number 3, page 37, on that day God formed a covenant with Avram, saying, to your seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt until the great river, the Euphrates River. The Canaanites, the Kenizzites, and the Kadmonites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Rephaim, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and Jebusites. The Torah tells us who is the seed of Avram that God is saying here that he will promise, or he's going to be giving this land. The pasuk says, "Ki biyitzchak yikara l'chazara." I'm just quoting from another verse, which is not in your text. Ki biyitzchak yikara l'chazara, which means that the child, the seed of Abraham, is considered Isaac, even though Abraham had many children. But the seed that the Torah speaks of, when God says, "I'm going to be giving Eretz Yisrael to your seed," who is it a reference to? Ki biyitzchak yikara l'chazara. This is a reference to Isaac specifically. Now, just to appreciate how important this gift of Eretz Yisrael is to the Jewish people and to the Torah in general, all we need to do is open up the very first verse of the Torah, which is Breishis bara Elokim, and in text number 4a, this is what we read. In the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth, the Torah continues to tell us the account of the creation. In the beginning. The word Bereshis is the Hebrew for the words in the beginning. Now, there were multiple words that the Torah could have chosen in order to be able to express the same idea. It could have said B'tchila at the beginning. It could have said Barishoina. The very first act of creation would have been this. However, the Torah specifically chooses the word Bereshis. And Rashi tells us you have to conclude that the Torah is trying to allude to something here. It could have chosen other words. Why is it telling you specifically the word Bereshis? Because there's something that's alluded to in this word. The word Bereshis actually is a contraction of Beis, the first letter of Beis, the second letter of Beis. Beis means two. Reshis meaning the very first. There are two which are the very first. What are these two things which are the very first? So Rashi tells us, before we go into text number 4b, Rashi tells us that these two are a reference to the Torah, where elsewhere in Scripture it's called, the Torah is called Reishis Darko, the beginning of God's way. It's the first thing that God, quote, created. In other words, this is His wisdom. And then, perhaps even earlier than that, God created the Jewish people. He had in mind the souls of the Jewish people, that they fulfill the Torah. So this is the reason why the word Bereshis is featured at the beginning of the Torah. But then Rashi comes along and tells us something else that's fascinating. He tells us, why did the Torah begin with the whole account of creation altogether? Why was it important to have this description of the creation? The Torah really is a book of law. It's telling us how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. Torah is similar to the word hora. Hora is instruction, guidance. So if the Torah's purpose is to convey divine instruction, why not simply begin with the very first instruction, which only appears in the next book, in the book of Exodus? The mitzvah about establishing the new month, etc. Rashi deals with this right at the very beginning. Here's what he says in text number 4b, page 38. Let's take a look. In the beginning, said Rabbi Yitzchak, shouldn't the Torah have started with the verse, "This month is to you"? Meaning, shouldn't the Torah just have begun with the mitzvah of establishing the new month, which is the first commandment that the Israelites were commanded? Why then did he start with, in the beginning, good evening, in the beginning, meaning the story of creation? Why was that necessary? Because the strength of his works, so Rashi comes and answers the question. He says, because the strength of his works, quoting a verse, the strength of his works he related to his people to give them the inheritance of the nations. For if the nations of the world should say to Israel, "You are thieves, you are robbers, for you conquered by force the lands of the seven nations of Canaan," they will reply, "The entire earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He. He created it and gave it to whomever He deemed proper. When He wished, He gave it to them, and when He wished, He took it away from them and gave it to us." So the Rashi is telling us here, based on the Medrash, why does the Torah begin with the words, with the whole account, with the whole account of Bereshit, of the creation? Because the Torah is trying to tell you that God created the world. God created every land. God settled certain peoples on that land. And when they didn't follow what He wanted them to follow, He took them off, He removed them from there, and gave the land to the Jewish people. When the Jewish people, unfortunately, didn't follow what God wanted them to follow, He removed them from there as well. But nonetheless, it was a nachlas olam. It was inheritance forever. So even though the Jewish people left physically, but nonetheless, as we'll see later, it's something that remained. It's something that remained, that we remain attached to, and we will ultimately come back to. The point being that God gave us this as an inheritance. God gave us this land. God created the world, and He gave us this inheritance. So really what Rashi is telling us here is an amazing thing. The entire book of Genesis, the entire book of Parshas, that deals with the life of the patriarchs, the story of the flood, the story of Adam in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, the whole story of Yaakov and his sons descending into Egypt, the whole account from beginning to end was for what purpose? Was to teach us that God gave us the land of Israel. Really, if the Torah could have started in the middle of Exodus, middle of Parshas B'Shab, middle of Parshas Boy, actually, the third Sedra of Exodus. Why did it have to give us this entire account? The whole purpose is to demonstrate God created the world, God gave us the land of Israel, it's ours. In case, in the future, and you better believe this is exactly what happened, in the future, when the nations of the world will challenge our rights to the land of Israel, we say to them, this is our deed. And I have to tell you, personally, I was very proud to see the ambassador of Israel. He didn't stand up in the United Nations, but he sat while he was talking. But he stood up very strongly, saying, he took out a chumash and he read the verses and he said, this is our deed to the land of Israel. This is our deed. This is what it is. This is just what it is. Now you want to claim the Bible, the Bible, you can claim all you want. This is our deed. He just said it as it is, without it being apologetic. And don't forget, Rashi was writing this at a time when the Crusaders were on their way to the land of Israel to conquer it. So this was a very timely, it was definitely on their minds at that time. So the reason why they make up all kinds of claims about the Temple Mount is because they know this is our strongest link. They know this is our strongest connection to the land of Israel. In text number 5, this is from Natan Sharansky, page 39. When the leaders of Hamas, like Yasser Arafat in his day, were or are prepared to consider recognition of the fact of Israel's existence, but not its right to existence, they are not playing word games. That is why Arafat reiterated over and over again his supposedly historical claims with regard to the absence of the connection between the Temple Mount and the Jewish people. It was clear to him that the historical connection that is anchored and based in Jewish tradition is the basis for the existence of the state of Israel. And without it, the state would disappear, just as it appeared from the sea, quote. The difference between Israeli identity and Jewish identity is exactly the difference between the fact of existence and the right to exist. The difference is between a group of people that live on a piece of land and speak the Hebrew language and the descendants of a people that are scattered throughout the world who have returned to their historic homeland. If heaven forbid we cut ourselves off from the chain that links us to the Jewish people, if we cut ourselves off from 3,000 years of Judaism, if we cut ourselves off from being the realization of 2,000 years of Jewish hope for next year in Jerusalem, then we will lose the right to our existence. And in losing that right, we will be lost. This is Natan Sharansky speaking over here with regard to the connection that we need to maintain with not just the land of Israel, but with Judaism in general, because it's Judaism, it's the Torah that gives us the right to our land. That's what gives us the right to be there. So that is a compelling argument. I want to just mention, going back to Rabbi David Nesanoff, that I mentioned earlier, I recall hearing from him in one of his interviews that he gave after this whole story with Helen Thomas, that he was looking for a message. He was being requested, the requests were coming through to be interviewed by every television station. Everybody wanted to talk to this guy. Once it went viral, everybody wanted to hear what he had to say. So he asked a Chabad rabbi in Long Island, Rabbi Grossbaum, to advise him on what the message should be. So he sent him to Rabbi Avram Shem Tov from the American Friends of Lubavitch in Washington. Rabbi Shem Tov advised him to say the following. He said, imagine you have a friend who you haven't seen in 50 years. So it's always nice to get back together again and you remember your friendship from then. But the truth is that you're two separate people and your friendship isn't really, it can tire over time. It can, you don't remain as close as you are if you haven't seen each other for, as close as you were, if you haven't seen each other for 50 years. However, when you have a child who you haven't seen in 50 years, that connection is a natural connection. It's a natural bond. You're never going to become disconnected. It's your child. We are the Jewish people. We are called what? B'nei Yisrael, the sons of Israel, meaning our connection to the land of Yisrael, to the land of Israel, is like a child to a father, like a child to a mother. And so our bond with the land can never be severed. We may have been out of the land for a long time. We may have lived in Poland and in Germany. That doesn't in any way sever our relationship. Our relationship is just as tight and well connected and solid as it was when we left. It's just for whatever reason, we couldn't continue living there temporarily. But just like your parents cannot be severed from the child. Your parents, you never become divorced from your parents. You can't become divorced from the land of Israel. And that was a message he just kept on going out and repeating and repeating and repeating, and it ultimately made its mark.
Is that the same Shem Tov that Meyer wrote?
That's his uncle.
So,
That's his uncle. Okay. Now there's another whole dimension to this, which we're just going to touch upon today, which relates to the issue of land for peace, the whole argument of land for peace, which we discussed really at great length on Shabbos afternoon a couple months ago by the Shal Shudas Shir. The whole question of land for peace. Of course, it's the land of Israel, and we are not permitted to give up any part of the land of Israel. God gave it to us as a gift, and all of these things are true and relevant and important to mention, etc. However, when it comes to negotiating safety, quote, peace, right? This is the whole idea. We're supposed to be negotiating peace, a negotiated settlement between the sides. What can we consider? What are our options? Could we consider handing over portions of the land of Israel? So, the crux of the matter is really held in text number 6, which is a quote from the Shulchan Aruch. It's the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, but of course it comes from the Shulchan Aruch that preceded him, a couple hundred years, preceded by works of the Rishonim, of the medieval scholars. There is a ruah specifically in text number 6. Here's what it says. With regard to a Jewish city close to the border, even if enemies mount an attack and come only for the purpose of taking straw and stubble, we should take up arms and desecrate the Shabbos to defend ourselves from them. For if we do not prevent their coming, they may conquer the city, and from there the rest of the land will be easy for them to conquer. When it comes to the land of Israel, giving away any portion of the land is like giving away your border town. First of all, it's a very narrow piece of land. It's just a very small place. It's smaller than New Jersey. So if you slim it down halfway, if you give up, just for example, you give up the West Bank, what you're doing is you're bringing a terrorist regime right to your doorstep, which means you can fly that over in 2 minutes. It's baffling that there's even a consideration to do that. It's just shocking that people would even consider to do that. We'll give you security arrangements. There's no security arrangements that can take the place of a portion of land. There's no way, and that's something which really is supported by the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch here is telling us you have to be extremely careful, especially when it comes to a border town. Because when they come to a border town, all you need to do is open up the border, and they're in. And now they're here to attack you, and now you can't take them down. It's much harder. So you have to be much more careful. And so this was the argument that many great leaders repeated over and over and over again, why, when it comes to negotiating a peace treaty, we cannot compromise on land. We're willing to give you economics, we're willing to give you other nice things, but we can't give you land. Can't be part of the equation. Okay, having said that, what is really our purpose in the land of Israel? What's the purpose of having a land? Of course, it's a holy land. Everybody calls it a holy land. Even non-Jews call it the Holy Land. Holy Land tours. You hear this all the time. You hear advertisements on the radio for people to come. We'll tour the Holy Land. Everybody recognizes it to be a holy land. What's the purpose? Where did this all start from? It started from our forefather Avram Avinu. In text number 7, and God said to Avram, "Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you." So God takes Avram, he plucks him out of Aram Naharaim, wherever he was over there up north in Assyria, And he takes him, he tells him, I want you to go down to a place that I will show you. Rabbi Brachya said, what did Avram resemble? A bottle of perfume closed with a tight-fitting lid, lying in a corner so that its fragrant smell could not spread. When it was moved, however, its fragrance was spread. Similarly, God said to Avram, travel from place to place, and your name will become great in the world. So God wanted Avram to spread his message. So what does he do? He comes to the land of Israel, in text number 8a, and he planted an Eshel, which is an orchard in Be'er Shava. There are different explanations of what Eshel means. And he called there in the name of the Lord, the God of the world. What does this mean? He called there in the name of the Lord, the God of the world. What does this mean? So Rashi brings down, and we're going to see this in 8b and 8c. Here's what Rashi says. And he called there, by means of that Eshel, of that orchard, the name of the Holy One, blessed be He, was called God of the whole world. How did that happen? So he says, after his guests would eat and drink, Avram would say to them, bless the one of whose food you have eaten. Do you think that you have eaten of my food? You have eaten of the food of the one who spoke, and the world came into being. So people would come through. He had this tent. The tent had 4 openings. He had an opening on each side to make it even more convenient for people. They don't even have to walk around the entire tent. They could just walk straight in. And he made sure to have food prepared for them, and feed them, and give them drink, make them comfortable. And then when they were done, he would say, recognize that God is the creator of the world. God gave us the sustenance. Some people would give him a hard time, so then he would say, it's a pay up. To get such a meal in the middle of the desert is not going to be so cheap. So you can choose which one you want to do. Either recognize God as the creator, or you can pay up for the meal. And so I'm guessing that more often than not, he probably had many people benching, reciting the grace of the benediction after the meal. Then, in text number 8c, we read, this is from the Talmud, read not, and he called. The Hebrew word for and he called is vayikra. So Reish Lakish tells us, read not, and he called, vayikra, but and he made to call, vayakri, meaning he brought others to call, thereby teaching that our father Abraham caused the name of the Holy One, blessed be He, to be uttered by the mouth of every passerby. So in other words, you have to just kind of reformulate the word vayikra, al tikre vayikra ele vayakri. It's not that he called himself on his own, but vayakri, he called others. He got others to call. In other words, he got others to call out towards God and say, thank you, God, and recognize God. So this all begins with Avram Avinu. The service of the Jewish people, the work of the Jewish people, the task of the Jewish people begins with Avram. He was the trailblazer. He was the pioneer. He started this whole process. He is going to be the one to bring God's word to the world, a consciousness of the divine to the world. Like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says in the Kuzri. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was one of the great Jewish philosophers, and I encourage everybody to take a look at his work. It's a wonderful work called the Kuzri or the Kuzari, depending on how you pronounce it. And he says over here in text 9a, the land of Israel was appointed and designated to teach the proper way of behavior to the entire world. God put us in the land of Israel so that we can serve as a model nation, as a model people for how a moral society, a godly society conducts itself. That's why we're there. That's why God gave us the land. So, how did this process work? God chose the land, or God chose the land because it was already something special, so God chose the land to be also for the Jewish people. So here's a very interesting insight. Think about it this way. The car is overheating, and there's a little gauge inside the car that tells you that it's overheating. Why is the car overheating? Because the gauge says, or because it's actually overheating, and that's the reason for the gauge. It's like they tell the story about there was a drought. There was a drought in a Jewish town. And so they would normally get together and they would pray. They would pray, and then then rain would come. But there was a certain fellow who noticed that the cat used to always come into the house. He kind of got the sense that there's going to be a rain, so he used to come into the house. So the next time there was a drought, this fellow, the owner of the cat, said, you know what, why do we have to do all this prayer? Let's just take the cat in from outside, and then we'll have rain. So the point is the same. The gauge is an indication of what's really going on. So in the following text, the Rebbe introduces us to an interesting concept. And that is that God chose Eretz Yisrael. He chose the land. Now when you choose something, we talked about this in one of the previous courses. When you choose something out of pure, unmitigated free choice, then that indicates that there's something very deep that connects you to that item or to that thing that you're choosing. Let's give an example here. You know, you have a store next door that's, you like ice cream. You like ice cream? Okay, ice cream, why not? Good, right? But this store has 25 different flavors of ice cream. But the chocolate ice cream that you like, they don't have. So you walk into the store, you check all the different 25 types of ice cream, and you say, you know what, I might have to settle for this one. So you're choosing one of the 25. Are you really choosing? Or you're making a decision that's an educated decision based on the pros and cons. Okay, I'm going to choose this one because it's going to benefit me more. I'm going to feel better about it. What happens if you have another store next door? And this store doesn't have 25, but it has exactly the one that you want. And so you walk in there and you say, okay, I want this one. I'm going to take this one. Which of these selections is really your choice? Where are you choosing more? Where would you say choice is activated more?
Chocolate.
It's the case of the chocolate because that's what you really want. So choice isn't just selection based on certain dimensions of any given item. It's not just It's not just your not just discretion between this item and the other item and what's going to bring me more benefit. I may not actually like the one that I chose, but I chose it. I took that. I selected that. The one that you really want, that's the one you chose. That's the one you choose. So when we speak of God choosing Eretz Yisrael, choosing the land of Israel as the place that He's going to dwell and the place that He wants the Jewish people to be, this is it tells us that the choice, the fact that the Torah describes it as a choice that God makes, tells us that there's a very deep connection between the land and the Almighty. And that's in text number 9b. God did not choose the land of Israel because of the holiness in it. On the contrary, the holiness comes as a result of God's choice. You see that? Why is Israel the holy land? Because God chose it to be that way. God chose it as to be His favorite land, is His choice, His land of choice. That's what is ma'anik. In the Hebrew you say ma'anik. That's what feeds, or that's what supports, that's what sustains its holiness.
It's an action versus being something that's passive. God is actually choosing it. That's an action.
He's choosing it, and because He chooses it, that's what gives it its holiness. God's decision to choose the land of Israel is an example of bechira atzmis, an uncompelled choice made of God's own pure power of free will, and this is why the land of Israel is the heritage of God. And that's where we have all these advantages to the land of Israel. So the land of Israel, of course, has many beautiful things about it. It's a beautiful land. It's a startup nation. It's technologically advanced. All kinds of great virtues. What makes Eretz Yisrael the special land that it is? The fact that God chose it.
I've gone to a lecture actually in Israel, right when the first funding started to happen for the human genome project. And the way
You may have to introduce us all to what the Human Genome Project is.
Human Genome was when we started to really tag genes to have an idea of what genes, what
The map of
genotype of what genes created the phenotype of what you actually saw.
Okay.
And the way this was explained.
No, that was when they saw the genes. They don't know every connection.
Right, but the actual mapping of
That was the mapping.
of what A is starting to equal B.
So what do they say in the lecture?
Genotypes and phenotypes start to match up.
That comes afterwards.
Right, well,
That's certainly not completed.
no, it's not completed.
So what
That's
happened in the lecture?
Starting of the Genome Project. But the way the lecturer said then, to say something like, oh, well, look at the land of Israel, and isn't it interesting? In the Torah, it also says, this is how it's going to be. It's the same way as if, like we said, look at that guy. See, he's approximately 5'9" tall, and has bright blue eyes. And isn't it fascinating coincidence that if you also look at the DNA sequencing, we actually see some sequencing for mid 5 foot, 5'8" to 5'10", and blue eyes. Isn't that an interesting coincidence that we see it, and the genes, if we go back, also show that that's the case? But he said,
So
of
they were
course,
drawing
that
a
sounds
parallel
crazy
between that.
because it is crazy. It's not coincidence in any way. It's because of A
That's right.
is B.
Exactly.
Because the DNA says
That's
what
right.
the DNA says.
Yeah.
This guy, 30 years later, is 5'9",
the way he is,
bright
exactly.
blue eyes.
Sorry,
Right,
but
right.
it's not just the DNA.
Not a coincidence whatsoever. You know?
Okay, there's another point here that Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan makes in his work, Jerusalem, Eye of the Universe. This is in text number 10, page 45. He says, if you look at a map, you will see that the geographical location of the land of Israel virtually guaranteed that it would play a key role in the tides of civilization. The old world consisted of two great land masses, Eurasia, Europe and Asia, and Africa. It was impossible to travel from Eurasia to Africa without passing through the Holy Land. Therefore, every conqueror, every civilization that passed from one continent to the other had to pass through the Holy Land and come in contact with the Jew. Besides being a gateway between north and south, the Holy Land is part of the keystone link between east and west. There are mountains in Israel where a cup of water spilled on the western slope will eventually flow into the Atlantic Ocean, while one spilled on the eastern slope will flow into the Pacific. Today, these oceans are linked by the Suez Canal, but in the past, most caravan routes linking the Atlantic and Pacific passed directly through the Holy Land. The land of Israel was therefore literally the crossroads of civilization. This is a very interesting point, and it just speaks to the idea that the land of Israel served as an essential role in promulgating the ideas of monotheism and demonstrating what a moral society should look like. Now, there's also another very interesting, unique dimension of the land of Israel, and that is that it is not like Egypt, where in Egypt the fields are sustained by what? By the Nile. They have a whole irrigation system, at least they used to. They had a whole irrigation system, and the water rises, and then it spreads out throughout the entire land, and that's how they sustained all of the crops. Whereas in Eretz Yisrael, it was not like that. God tells us specifically, the land of Israel is not so. I want you to recognize that you are dependent on God for rain. In text number 11a, for the land to which you are coming to possess, is not like the land of Egypt, out of which you came, where you sowed your seed and which you watered by foot like a vegetable garden. But the land to which you pass to possess is a land of mountains and valleys and absorbs water from the rains of heaven. Specifically, it's specifically rain. What's the idea of rain? That we have to recognize that we are dependent on God. That's really the spiritual backbone of our existence in Israel. Recognizing that we're here by the grace of God, by the blessing of God, by the protection of God. In text number 11b, why did God set up a situation in which Israel's rain only comes from above? One of the reasons is so that in this way everyone will turn their eyes heavenward. When a person knows that he has to rely upon the rain of heaven, then even when he has an abundance, he is prevented from making the mistake detailed in the verse, which says, and your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and gold increase, and all that you have increases, and your heart grows haughty, and you forget the Lord your God. This is because the person knows that no matter how much effort he puts into the land by plowing, planting, etc., he still must approach God in prayer. Contrast this with living in Egypt, where God established the natural order such that at specific times the Nile rises and waters the fields. To the physical eye, this happens without any need to pray to God, lulling a person into telling himself, my strength, quote, my strength and the might of my hand has accumulated this wealth for me. And God forbid, forget completely the next verse which states, but you must remember the Lord your God, for it is He that gives you strength to acquire wealth. So this is another important dimension of the land of Eretz Yisrael. Similar to the idea that we talked about before about the dial, the indicator inside the car. So you have, for example, a Sefer Torah. A Sefer Torah is a scroll written with beautiful inscriptions, which contains the entire Torah, and it's on parchment. What gives this parchment its holiness? What gives the parchment its holiness is the words. You wrote the words onto the Torah, so now the parchment becomes holy. In a similar way, the same concept applies with regard to Eretz Yisrael. What makes Eretz Yisrael the desirable place that we want to all return to? It's the fact that God chose it. God made it our home. God gave us a mission to accomplish while being there. That's why we wish to return there. If it wasn't for that, then we might as well make a country elsewhere. We could make a country in Uganda. Why specifically Eretz Yisrael? God chose it. It makes it the Holy Land. That's where we have a mission. That's where we have a place. That's what gives us our homeland. That's why it is our homeland.
When you write a Sefer Torah, it's not just writing the words, it's your intention to make it holy.
That's also true. Yeah, for sure. So the Pasuk tells us in text number 12a, Israel is a land the Lord your God looks after. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. God is watching Israel all the time. Every time and all the time. What is this idea of Einei Hashem, of God's eyes? The implication of God's eyes resting or being trained and focused on the land of Israel is that we are able to see divine providence there more openly. I don't think anybody could deny that our whole existence there, amongst 70 wolves, quite literally, is a miracle. There's no question about it that the existence of the state of Israel today is a miracle. There's no other explanation for it. It's a miracle from God. Yeah, we can talk about the United Nations and that's not that. If it was just for the United Nations, just for the nations of the world, we wouldn't have gone long ago. We wouldn't make it through the War of Independence. So the idea that God's providence is more evident in Eretz Yisrael, this is something Maimonides tells us in the guide for the perplexed, in text number 12b. This is in section 1, chapter 44 of the guide. He says, "Tamid einei Hashem elokech ba hashkachas yola." The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, means that His providence is upon it. His providence is upon it. And so therefore, it goes without saying that the conduct of the people in the land of Israel needs to be aligned with the will of the Creator of heaven and earth, who gave us the land and asks us to be there and gives us a mission to accomplish there. And that's why the Pasuk tells us, although it has somewhat of an ominous message as well, but I think we have to always look at the positive side. In text number 13, "You shall not defile yourselves by any of these things, for the nations whom I am sending away from before you have defiled themselves with all these things, namely idolatry, immoral behavior, etc. And the land became defiled, and I visited its sin upon it, and the land vomited out its inhabitants." It vomited out its inhabitants. "But as for you, you shall observe my statutes and my ordinances, and you shall not do like any of these abominations, neither the native nor the stranger who sojourns among you, for the people of the land who preceded you did all of these abominations, and the land became defiled. And let the land not vomit you out for having defiled it, as it vomited out the nation that preceded you." What he's saying here is that there is this constant tension that is ever present in the land of Israel. Meaning, if for whatever reason somebody's life is not aligned with what the Torah, or I should say the Jewish people collectively, it's not aligned with what the Torah wants of us, what God tells us He wants of us, so there's this constant tension where the land is seeking to vomit us out. And the remedy for that, obviously, is strengthening the observance of Torah, strengthening doing mitzvahs. And this is what brings us our salvation. This is what brings us our protection in the land of Israel. And I'm reminded of before the 67 war, which my father was in Eretz Yisrael for that, the Rebbe started a huge campaign to get Jewish men to put on tefillin. Put on tefillin. They went over to army bases and they stopped people in the street. And there are videos all about this that actually, I think if you attended the course about survival of a nation, which we had just a couple, was it last year I think, on Israel, we explored this at great length. It was the 50th anniversary of 67, of the 6-Day War. So we talked all about this then. So what's the point? The point is that the mitzvahs and the Torah that's studied, and the mitzvahs that are performed, the good deeds that are performed, the chesed, the kindness that's performed in Eretz Yisrael, this protects them. That's what, from God's perspective, this is what gives them their existence, their right to exist in the land. The question becomes, we are not in Israel. Of what significance is the land of Israel to us? So of course, the land of Israel, very first and foremost, at its most basic level, is an incredible place of refuge. After the war, where you had, even for before the war, but even after the war, where you had hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees who were stuck in camps. They were in Cyprus, and they were in Germany, and they were all over the place in Europe. They needed a place to go. Conditions weren't very good. People were dying. It was dangerous. Jews were being killed. It became obvious and very clear that we needed a place of refuge. God gave us the place of refuge. This was an incredible miracle. And God helped us protect ourselves from our enemies who sought to destroy us and kill us then, even after the Holocaust. So it's clear that just on a most practical level, this is a place, of course, an incredible miracle of having a place of refuge where Jewish people can go. But then in terms of its spirituality, the spiritual side of things, in text 14, we read something interesting about the land of Israel. Here's what it says. Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina used to kiss the stones of Akko, saying, until here is the border of the land of Israel. Rabbi Zera crossed the Jordan while wearing his clothing. Rabbi Chia Barba used to roll around in the dust of Tiberias. The actual physical earth apparently was something that they found very spiritually uplifting. He used to roll around in the dust of Tiberias. Rabbi Chia the Great used to weigh the stones of the land of Israel. He would actually weigh them. Rabbi Hanania used to weigh the clods of earth of the land of Israel. So they fulfilled what is written, for your servants have desired its stones, and its dust they have cherished. This is a fulfillment of that verse. What's the point? The point is that there was value in the land itself. What was the value in the land itself? So here's the idea from a Hasidic perspective. God created the world for a purpose. What was that purpose? In the language of the Medrash, which is quoted time and time again in the works of Hasidus, God created the world, Lasois loy yisbarech dira b'tachtonim, which means He wanted a dwelling place. He wanted a place that He could feel at home, could feel welcome in the lower realms. In the lowest realm, which is the physical world. God wanted to be here. Why He wanted to be here? This is something God desired. Just like a desire is something we have no explanation for. In other words, we don't necessarily have to have a rational explanation for something that we innately desire. In a similar way, we use the same analogy for God, that God's desire of having a dwelling place here isn't something that we can explain rationally. We just know that through the Torah, God notified us that this is the way it is. He desires a dwelling place here. He wants to feel at home. He wants to feel at home in your home. He wants to feel at home in my home. He wants to feel at home in our physical activities, in our day-to-day life. He wants to feel at home. He doesn't want to feel like a stranger. He wants to know that you're conscious of God wherever you go, whatever you do. He wants to be there. He wants to be together with you. And that's the meaning of the pasuk when it says, God says that you make a tabernacle or a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them, say the Mefarshim, say the commentators, say the Medrash already, but then the commentators explain, B'soich kol echad ve'echad. Why does it say v'shachanti b'soichem, I will dwell in them? I thought you're only making one sanctuary. You're making a sanctuary, each person is the sanctuary. God wants to dwell within us, within our hearts, within our minds, within our activities. So, taking that even a step further, God wants to dwell even in the physical land. He wants to be there. He wants the physical land, physical earth, to be aligned with what He wants it to look like. And so, the whole process of our activities as Jewish people is removing the barrier between the physical and the spiritual. In other religions, there is no such a thing. They go off to a mountaintop and they meditate. They divorce themselves from the physical and they're only in the spiritual realm. In Judaism, it works the other way around. It's specifically a downward spiral, but a positive downward spiral. We're looking to elevate the earth. We're looking to elevate the physical world. And so, every time we do a mitzvah, which is an actionable mitzvah, we're elevating something within the realm of action. We're elevating the world. We're elevating the physical. We're bringing it to a higher state of being, to a higher state of consciousness. And that's the idea of the sages coming to Israel and literally kissing the stones. Because they recognize that this is where it's at. It's in the physical. It's in the maisa. So, our attachment to the land of Israel, our desire for the land of Israel has to be something that encourages us and prompts us to increase our desire for the mitzvahs. Because that's the whole point. The whole point of the land is that we're making a place for God to feel comfortable. We're bringing a God consciousness into the world. So, in that realm, along those lines, the following anecdote speaks to the value that we can have, even if we're not in Israel, the value that we can have for the same process, for the same idea of making the world into a place where God feels comfortable. In text number 1857, one of the great Hasidim asked the Tzemach Tzedek regarding his desire to travel and settle in the Holy Land. At that point, it was already possible, revealing to the Rebbe how much he desired to toil there in religious service. The Rebbe replied, Reb Hillel Paritcher is not lacking the spiritual level of Israel, yet you still want it. We have to make Israel here. Yes, make Israel here. He said, Mach do Eretz Yisrael, make Israel here. So yeah, you can physically locate yourselves to Eretz Yisrael, which ultimately we will all go. When the time comes, we will all be there. Those of us who are still in the diaspora, we have work to do here. What do we need to do? We need to make Eretz Yisrael here. We make the land of Israel here. How do we make the land of Israel here? By elevating the physical world where we are in the present state. In text number 15b, even though this place is not the land of Israel, the fact that we are found in the diaspora at present is not mere happenstance. Divine providence dictates that there is a godly intent and purpose in the present circumstance that is linked to the service of the land of Israel. The intent of this service is to make the rest of the world a dwelling place for the divine, or as the Tzemach Tzedek termed it, make the land of Israel here where godliness is evident. Since a Jew is called Israel, he is provided with the strength to transform the diaspora environment into a spiritual Israel. Now I just want to put out the disclaimer that this is not a dismissal in any way of the importance of having the land itself. The land of Eretz Yisrael is the land of Eretz Yisrael. If we are in Chutz La'aretz, if we are in the diaspora, God put us here. So God gave us a mission here. So if we're talking about, this goes into the question of Aliyah, making Aliyah, which we talked about also about a great length on Shabbos afternoon a few months ago. The question of Aliyah is a very broad question and affects many people. In general, our attitude to Aliyah, I'll just tell you in just a short nugget, our attitude to Aliyah is if you're an individual, you're a private individual, you don't have any special influence in your community, and you have the opportunity to earn a parnasa in Eretz Yisrael, proper parnasa in Eretz Yisrael, and you are positive that you're going to be able to continue fulfilling the Torah mitzvahs, perhaps even better in Eretz Yisrael, then by all means go and settle Eretz Yisrael. However, if going to Eretz Yisrael would possibly mean falling in your service of God, in other words, not maintaining the same standard and perhaps rolling back some of your commitment, then it's best actually if you stay in the diaspora. That's our attitude in general. Now, just to conclude with an interesting statement in the Medrash, which is that ultimately Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, meaning the holiness that pervades the land of Israel, will expand to the entire world. When Mashiach will come, the holiness, the God consciousness that's in the land of Israel. We spoke about this before, that there's a special divine providence in the land of Israel. So that God consciousness, that divine consciousness will be something that will spread throughout the entire world. What will then distinguish Eretz Yisrael from everywhere else? So the Medrash goes further and says, Jerusalem will expand to the borders of Israel. And the holiness that is within the Temple Mount, will expand to all of Jerusalem. In other words, these are different levels of intense revelation, intense closeness with God. With recognizing God as the Creator, recognizing that God is here, He's sustaining us, He's taking care of all of our needs. This is what it's all about ultimately. It's all about a divine consciousness. So that will become so widespread, so pervasive throughout the world, that we will say that the entire world is Eretz Yisrael. The entire Eretz Yisrael is Yerushalayim. The entire Beis Hamikdash is now, etc. In text number 6a, in the Messianic age, says the Medrash, Jerusalem will spread to encompass all of Israel, and Israel will spread to encompass the entire world. What does this mean? Text number 16b. The meaning of this statement is that in Messianic times, the world overall will attain the spiritual standing that Israel enjoys today. By the same token, Israel itself will then rise to the superior level of the holy city, Jerusalem, which will in turn be elevated to an even higher spiritual level. The Messianic age will, in fact, see an elevation of the entire universe, including all the spiritual realms. In the Messianic era, the world will be cleansed of impurity, as it is written, and I will remove the spirit of impurity from the land. Thus, even the rest of the world, which now conceals God's presence, will not present an impediment to the open revelation of godliness. I'm going to get back to this in a minute just to try to explain. The entire world at that time will enjoy a manifestation in the manner in which God is revealed even today in the land of Israel. That is the meaning of the teaching that in Messianic times, the land of Israel, meaning its spiritual status, will spread over the entire world. And Israel itself, along with the entire spiritual hierarchy of creation, will then rise to an even greater, even higher spiritual levels. He's saying they'll rise to even higher spiritual levels because the spiritual worlds, meaning the spiritual reality, will also increase in its divine consciousness. We think of spirituality as that's where the ultimate truth is in spirituality, and there's nothing left for it to grow. There's nothing left for it to move forward. And so one of the points he's making here is that even the spiritual realms will experience it'll be augmented, it'll be increased to a whole new level, and that will also reflect itself in the physical world. But then there's another point that he made over here with regard to the world being cleansed of impurity. And that he said in the last paragraph, he says, even the rest of the world which now conceals God's presence will not present an impediment to the open revelation of godliness. So it's not just that the world will become transparent to God. It's much more than that. Just to explain, there is a difference of opinion between two Tanaic sages with regard to the degree in which wild animals, dangerous animals, will no longer pose a danger. There is an opinion that says that God will be mashbisan min ha'olam, God will completely vanquish them from the world, that He'll remove them from the world. Lions, tigers, animals that are dangerous, God will still remove them. That's one opinion. Another opinion says no. What He's going to remove is actually their dangerous properties. Their nature will change. When the prophet Isaiah says that the sheep, the lamb, will lie with the lion. I'm sorry, the Gavar Zeivim Kevis, that the wolf will lie with the lamb. What that means is that the wolf will no longer be a dangerous animal, but it won't simply cease to exist. It will be a wolf, but its nature will change. The darkness will turn into something positive. Now the wolf will be only a positive force. Darkness will no longer be a negative force, but rather darkness will be transformed into something that becomes positive. In a similar way, we experience this on our personal level, I should say daily, on a daily basis, or all the time. We see that sometimes things don't go well, but then that turns into a comeback. That itself turns into a comeback. The fact that something negative happened to us, that negativity turns into something positive. Sometimes we experience that. We're just using that as an analogy for this concept. The idea that ultimately, in the end of days, when Mashiach will come, the darkness will turn into light. Not just that darkness will cease to be, the darkness will turn into light. And so that's what he means to say over here, that even the rest of the world, which now conceals God's presence, will not present an impediment to the open revelation of godliness. It's not just that it won't present an impediment, it actually will reveal God's oneness. When the wolf ceases to be a dangerous animal, that tells you that there's a creator in the world. That itself is testimony to it. And so that's ultimately the purpose of our service of God in general, our service of God in Eretz Yisrael specifically, and that's really the purpose of our existence here as Jewish people.
What was the discussion? It's kind of sound horrible, but besides remembering who the argument was between and what they were arguing about, I have it down perfectly. If I'm right, let the Jordan River flow backwards. If I'm right, let the mountains skip like rams. And sure enough, this happened exactly how he said it, and the one whom he argued said, that's all fantastic. But we have a procedure. We have a procedure, how we look at the law and
Correct.
how we analyze the law, and we have a protocol and we have a discourse.
Correct.
And it's not about mountains and streams and pantheism and skipping anything. And God said, my children have surpassed me, something along those lines.
Correct. You're referring to a discussion between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua.
That's exactly what
They were arguing about a certain type of oven, if it's susceptible to ritual impurity or not. Rabbi Eliezer wouldn't give in. This was a point in history where consensus was extremely important, and abiding by the majority opinion was extremely important, and they would not accept Rabbi Eliezer disagreeing and maintaining his view in the face of the majority view. The majority said one thing, he said something else, and so he was going to demonstrate that he's right. How did he do it? By miraculous feats. The response to that was that Torah is not in heaven. Torah is not in heaven. Torah has been submitted to the rationale of, in terms of determining the law, Torah has been submitted to the rationale of the human.
So why here does it seem the contra of that? That
In what
we'll
respect?
know there's a God when the wolf ceases to have the natural characteristics of the wolf.
How is that a contradiction?
Meaning, why do we need something natural, something physical to show us there's a God? Why
That's
can't
not-
it be more?
That's not a miraculous temporary
going against
reversal.
one's law?
It's not a temporary reversal. It's a
Going
fundamental
against a million
change.
years of breeding and coding and
But it's not a
imprint
temporary
and
thing.
instinct.
That's what I'm trying to say. It's not a temporary change like Rabbi Eliezer did.
Okay.
This is simply God is removing the force of impurity from the world. It's no longer a force of impurity.
All right, understood.
Now it's all positive. Now it's all good. Now it's all simply testimony to God's presence. To
And it's
God's
probably not just the wolf. That's just going to be an obvious, easy example, right? It's probably on all kinds of things.
yes.
We just
For sure.
don't have that sensitivity, that kind of meter, to see that it ceased its any darkness in its otherwise nature has ceased to.
Well, it hasn't happened yet.
Exist.
We're hoping it will.
Versus in a wolf, we know how wolves act. We're
Correct.
sensitive enough.
That's correct. Yes.
We're sensitive enough gauges
Correct.
to know that wolf shifted its nature.
That's right. Yeah. The prophet uses them as the example. But,
Just 'cause
obviously
there's
that applies to
something
many
tangible
others.
that we know that we're sensitive enough to.
That's right. Okay. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you everybody listening online.
Normally when a Excellent.